It's kind of wild when you really start digging into what life was like in New York City back in the late 1800s. Like, just imagine this, 70 or 80 kids crammed into one single tenement building. And get this, you might actually have to pay more to live in a tiny rundown slum apartment than like a decent place uptown. It's a pretty brutal picture of poverty, right? But today we're going to take that reality and kind of look at it through this totally different lens, the lens of the law of one, those channel teachings.
It's really interesting, isn't it? The huge range of human experience that we're looking at here. On one hand, you've got Jacob Riis and how the other half lives, which just gives you this gut-wrenching, really grounded understanding of what it was like to just survive back then.
Yeah.
And then we're going to bring in the law of one, which zooms out to like this vast cosmic perspective, talking about consciousness and existence and how everything is interconnected on this grand scale.
Yeah, exactly. And this deep dive, this is really for you, the listener. We want to kind of explore these two sets of information that on the surface seem like they have nothing to do with each other. Rees gives us this super detailed snapshot of, well, I guess the lack of societal well-being in a really specific time and place. And then the law of one just comes in with this almost opposite, super zoomed out, unified understanding of consciousness and where we fit into the cosmos. So our mission today is to try to pull out those key takeaways from both of these sources and see if, as we kind of talk through them, any surprising connections pop up.
Sounds fascinating. So maybe a good starting point would be with a more concrete reality that Rees lays out for us and how the other half lives. So when we talk about these tenements, what exactly were they? I mean, like legally and physically, how do they define them?
Okay, so let's break it down. Legally, a tenement was a building with at least 3 families living there, all cooking their own meals, right? Or if there were more than 2 families on a single floor, sharing those common areas and doing their cooking, that was also a tenement. But obviously, the actual reality of living in a tenement was way worse than just that definition. Picture these brick buildings, 4, 5, 6 stories high, usually facing the street. You'd often find a saloon at street level, and sometimes they'd even have these sneaky side doors so they could keep serving drinks on Sundays, even though it was against the law. Each floor was usually packed with 4 families, and their living space was basically just a couple of dark little closets that they used as bedrooms, plus a living room that might only be like 12 feet by 10 feet. Can you imagine that?
Wow. And I'm guessing the basic infrastructure of these buildings wasn't exactly built to handle that many people.
Oh, definitely not. Reese talks about these staircases that were just these dark shafts in the middle of the building, and there was basically zero ventilation going from one apartment to the next. So each family was basically sealed off in their own little airless box. And it could get even worse because sometimes behind the building, facing the street, there'd be another building, maybe 3 stories high, crammed in there. And they'd squeeze even more families in on each floor. And this wasn't some temporary thing either. Rees is really clear about how this kind of situation just got worse and worse over time as more and more people kept pouring into the city and all trying to cram into the same limited space.
It's incredible. And I mean, it seems pretty obvious what the driving force behind these awful conditions was, doesn't it? Rees straight up says that these tenements were good property.
Yeah, totally. It's like this twisted thing where the more desperate people were, the more money landlords could squeeze out of them. Reese points out this crazy thing. A beat-up old building downtown could actually bring in a third more rent than a decent building uptown. And the number of people crammed into these places is just mind-blowing. He mentions reports of 70, even 80 kids in just one tenement. And the crazy thing is, by the time he was writing this, it was so common that nobody even batted an eye. There's even one report about a building with over 100 adults and 90 kids all packed in. And right next door, almost the same number. And it wasn't just families either. They were taking in boarders, too. Like one time they did an inspection at midnight and found 150 people sleeping on the dirty floors in just 2 buildings. It makes you wonder, right? Does that extreme physical density, all those people crammed together like that, does that reflect some kind of blockage, internally, like a stagnation in thinking or something? That kind of makes me think about the law of one and all that talk about energy centers and stuff.
It's almost impossible to imagine that many people in such a small space. And of course, Rees goes into detail about the people who are living in these places, the different groups of immigrants, and how the city kind of formed these distinct ethnic neighborhoods.
Exactly. So you had all these different groups arriving: Italians, Russian and Polish Jews, Bohemians, Chinese, and they tended to kind of cluster together in their own little areas. But what's striking is what Reese says about them bringing their slums with them, so to speak. Even as they were trying to make a new life, they were recreating the conditions they had left behind. Like, he says Little Italy was already getting just as bad as the notorious Bend, which was the super dangerous slum area. And he contrasts that with some other immigrant groups who seem to manage to move up in society and leave those conditions behind. He even uses these vivid descriptions of how they colored the different neighborhoods on a map. Like the Jewish quarter was this dull gray, the Italian area was red, Chinatown was a bright yellow. It's like you can almost visualize these super concentrated pockets of poverty just by those colors. And then there's the Bohemian community, marked by this somber hue on the map, mostly concentrated around the cigar factories. It's fascinating to think about how that physical clustering, people living so closely together in these really defined areas, might relate to the idea of like shared consciousness or maybe even shared limitations, which makes me think of the group consciousness stuff in the Law of One.
It's a really interesting point. And beyond just, the incredible overcrowding, Rees also gets into the darker side of these neighborhoods, right? The
Yes.
crime and the fact that they were just completely lacking even basic necessities.
Absolutely. He talks about this area called the Fourth Ward, which was known for being super dangerous, like full of crime. And even decades later, it was still pumping out more criminals than the rest of the city put together. He even mentions these guys called the Swamp Angels, who were like these almost mythical thieves. And the crazy thing is, the physical environment itself almost seemed to encourage that kind of stuff. He describes this wild contrast between the houses that looked all respectable from the front, and then behind them, they'd have these hidden tenements that were often even taller than the ones in front. Imagine a 7-story building jammed behind a 3-story one. And then there's this alley on Roosevelt Street that he describes. It was barely wider than a single step, and there was this 5-story building that was getting its only light from that tiny sliver of space. On the other side of the alley, it was just a blank wall, like no sunlight could ever reach it.
And he makes this really powerful connection there, right? He compares it to this experiment that some English doctor did in the barracks, showing how people who don't get enough sunlight have higher death rates. It makes you think, maybe that lack of physical light is also like a lack of, I don't know, maybe what the Law of One would call spiritual light or something, like a lack of understanding or connection to something bigger.
It is a chilling thought, isn't it? And then he talks about the economic reality, which is that for a lot of employers, a workhorse was literally more valuable than the worker and their whole family. And then he switches to the Bowery, which was like this place that was always attracting young guys looking for a chance to make a life for themselves. They were drawn in by all these cheap lodging houses, but of course, a lot of them ended up falling on hard times, and those lodging houses just became breeding grounds for crime. There's this quote from Inspector Burns, and it's really stark. He says, "In 9 cases out of 10, turns out a thief or a burglar, if indeed he does not sooner or later become a murderer." It's like those cheap lodgings were literally turning these guys into criminals. And that makes you think about free will, right? Like in the Law of One, they talk a lot about free will, but how much free will do you really have when you're stuck in that kind of situation? When your material circumstances are so awful that you're basically forced into making bad choices.
It's a difficult question. And then, of course, the actual living conditions in the tenements themselves just contribute to that whole cycle of poverty and desperation, especially the lack of sanitation and all the disease that was running rampant.
Yeah, he paints this really grim picture of a place called Jewtown, where poverty and filth and disease were basically just all mixed together. There's this report from the Eastern Dispensary, and it's really blunt. It says that people weren't getting sick because they were somehow morally bad or anything like that. They were getting sick because they were ignorant, they didn't have enough food, and they were breathing this toxic air all the time. And it wasn't just that they were living in these places, they were working in them too. You had the sound of sewing machines going constantly, whole families working day and night in these tiny, cramped rooms. And they had to cook and eat and sleep in those same rooms too. Rees points out that it's totally different from the Bend, where people were desperate to get out onto the streets. In the tenements, everyone was trying to stay inside, away from everything, but even then, they were still all crammed together because there were just so many people. And the kids, even the ones too young to work, they were just adding to the crowding. So you had this constant exposure to disease and hardship that probably made it impossible for them to think about anything beyond just surviving.
Yeah.
Maybe that's kind of the opposite of what the Law of One is talking about, right? Like the emphasis on growth and service and all that.
Absolutely. And he includes some really powerful stories about individual families, which makes the whole thing so much more real and heartbreaking. You're not just dealing with these abstract numbers anymore.
For sure. Like, there's this one story about a family on Broome Street. The father was a suspender maker, and there were 6 of them living in a single room in this tiny little bedroom next to it. They were paying $10 a month for that. And when work was good, they might make $15 a week, but most of the time it was more like $3 or $4. They were always struggling. 10 cents for a little bit of coal, 12 cents a pound for meat, barely any butter or tea. And then there was the cheap milk, which they knew was probably contaminated, but they couldn't afford anything else. The health authorities knew it was killing people, especially kids, but it was still being sold. The daughter's eyesight was going from working all the time, and the father was desperately trying to save up for her dowry, because without a dowry, she probably wouldn't be able to get married. It's like every single aspect of their life was just completely consumed by this crushing poverty. And it makes you think about the idea of harvest and the Law of One, right? Were these people so focused on just staying alive that they didn't have any chance to grow spiritually? Like, could they even reach that point where they could graduate to a higher density?
It's so sad to think about. And it wasn't just one particular group facing these horrible conditions, like the Bohemian community, for example. They had their own specific struggles, mostly because they were so dependent on the cigar factories.
Yeah, they were at the mercy of the people who owned the factories, who often also owned the tenements they lived in. So you had these crazy rents. They demand key money just to let you move in. The wages were super low, and if you complained about anything, they could just evict you. It was a trap, basically. Riis is kind of amazed by how hard they worked, but how little they managed to save. He kind of blames it on them liking to have a beer and wanting to live as decently as they could, which is kind of messed up when you think about how little they were making. But the point is, the manufacturers had all the power, and they were exploiting the workers. And this makes me think about the law of free will, which the Law of One talks about so much. Like, how can you say these people had free will when the system was so rigged against them? And
That's a great point. And of course, Riis doesn't shy away from talking about the struggles of the black population in the city at that time, which were often overlooked or ignored by others.
absolutely. He talks about this neighborhood called Africa, and he gives some really disturbing examples of racism and exploitation by landlords. There's this one story about an elderly black woman who was paying way too much rent for these 2 tiny, rundown rooms. Reese wanted to bring her a Christmas dinner, but she wasn't even there. She was at the agent's, which probably meant she was being taken advantage of even more. He uses that story to show how much prejudice and injustice black people faced at that time.
Yeah.
And this kind of discrimination, judging people based on how they look, it seems like the opposite of what the Law of One is all about, right? Like the idea that all beings are part of the one.
It's really disturbing. And then there were the foundlings, those abandoned babies. Their situation was just horrific.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. Reese talks about how these infants were often just left in hallways or doorways with almost no hope. They usually ended up at this place called the Infants Hospital on Randall's Island. But the death rate there was incredibly high. Over 65% of the babies who were admitted died, and for the ones found on the streets, it was probably closer to 90%. He even found one baby that was still alive but had been put in a tiny coffin. And whenever times got tough, the number of abandoned babies, both alive and dead, would just skyrocket. Most of them ended up buried in mass graves in Potter's Field, sometimes just thrown into trenches by the dozen if the medical schools didn't need their bodies for dissection. It's just this complete disregard for human life for these tiny, helpless babies. It makes you think about compassion, right? Like, how much compassion did society have back then? And how does that fit with the idea of service to others in the Law of One?
It's a really tough question. And Riis gets even deeper into the problem by looking at the statistics of pauperism. The numbers show just how many people were completely dependent on charity just to survive.
Yeah, the numbers are staggering. In just 8 years, over 135,000 families in New York City were registered as either needing or getting charity. And for the 5 years before Riis wrote his book, 1 out of every 10 deaths in the city ended with a burial in Potter's Field. He did the math, and he figured out that meant almost 500,000 people were either begging or relying on charity at some point. He even breaks down the different types of cases that the Charity Organization Society dealt with. A tiny percentage were considered worthy of ongoing help, a bigger group needed temporary assistance, more than half were seen as needing work, and a pretty significant chunk were deemed not worthy of any help at all. And this whole idea of dividing people up into the worthy and the unworthy poor, that feels kind of judgmental, doesn't it? And maybe it goes against that whole idea of unity that the Law of One talks about.
It does seem pretty harsh. And of course, alongside those who genuinely needed help, you also had people who were taking advantage of the system.
Oh, yeah, he doesn't sugarcoat that at all. He talks about these petty thieves who preferred to trick people rather than resorting to violence. They'd steal laundry off clotheslines, or they'd target kids who had loose change, that kind of thing. And the ways they came up with to pretend they were poor and get money from people, they were incredibly creative, almost elaborate sometimes. He talks about how he herself had given money to this baby that turned out to be just a bunch of rags wrapped up to look like a baby. And this old woman who seemed completely destitute was actually just drunk. He even mentions people using fake babies, borrowed babies, even babies that they drugged to make them look sick and pitiful. And then there's this wild story about this Italian woman who got arrested for begging with a little kid. But when they searched her apartment, they found bank books showing that she had thousands of dollars saved up. It turned out they were like pauper capitalists pretending to be poor while secretly being pretty wealthy. It just shows how complex human nature can be, right? Maybe it even reflects that idea of illusion that comes up a lot in the Law of One.
But amidst all the stories of deception, Riis also makes sure to point out the cases where people were truly desperate. The ones who didn't just need a handout, but a real chance to work and make a decent living.
Yeah, there's this gut-wrenching story about a family who were starving in an uptown tenement. The father had to bury his baby in an old orange crate because they couldn't even afford a proper burial. And Riis is really clear that what these people needed wasn't just charity, it was work. Steady work that paid a living wage. He talks about how charity, even though it was meant to help, could actually be really demeaning and often wasn't enough to actually make a difference. He praises the efforts of the Charity Organization Society and other groups that focused on visiting families and helping them become self-sufficient. He even points out that they were spending insane amounts of money on charity every year, and he suggests that it might be better to invest in a labor bureau that could actually help people find jobs and get back on their feet. And that idea of self-sufficiency kind of lines up with the Law of One, doesn't it? Like the idea of individual growth and potential and all that.
It definitely does. So when you get down to it, what is Riis's main argument about what was causing all this poverty that he describes?
He's really clear about that. He believes that the key to solving the problem is to reform tenement housing. He says that these buildings were basically designed for people who were expected to fail, and sadly, a lot of them did end up living down to those low expectations. He's convinced that if they could just improve the living conditions in these buildings, it would do more to fight poverty than anything else. He mentions this statistic that seems good. At first, the death rates in the tenements were actually lower than in some other areas, but then he immediately asks, yeah, but what kind of person are these horrible conditions creating? Like, what kind of creature is being born in these places?
That's a pretty powerful statement. And he also addresses the difficulties involved in trying to actually change things, right? He talks about how some of the tenants themselves were destructive, and they weren't making things easy for the people who were trying to help.
Oh yeah, he's pretty blunt about that. He says, they are what the tenements have made them, which is kind of a sad thing to say. He tells this story about a guy who tried to do something good. He put in all these modern amenities in one of the buildings, but the tenants just wrecked everything because they didn't know how to use them or they just didn't care. And that made some people think that the people living in the tenements were just bad people, inherently bad. But Riis argues against that. He says that when people tried to help in a smart way and when they did it fairly, there were actually some really positive results. Like when Black people were able to move into decent housing, things got noticeably better for them. And he saw that Italians, even though they were living in awful conditions, actually had a natural instinct for cleanliness. It was just that their environment was making it impossible for them to keep things clean. So it's like he's saying that your environment really shapes how you act, how you behave, and what you're capable of. And that actually fits with the Law of One, too, doesn't it? It's kind of like the idea of creating spaces with good vibrations where people can actually thrive.
It is. This is a really interesting connection. So as we wrap up our look at how the other half lives, what are Riis's final thoughts? What does he think needs to happen to make a real difference?
He basically lays out a plan for reforming housing for the poor. He says it's a moral obligation and it's important for public health. But he also says it's just good economics. It'll actually save society money in the long run. And his big point is that tenements aren't going away anytime soon. So the solution is to fix them. He's really critical of those landlords who just slap on a coat of paint or put up some fancy decoration and call it a day. He talks about how much more effective it is to build well-designed model tenements like the ones that the Improved Dwellings Association was building. And he's a big advocate for better urban planning. Like, he really liked the idea of building tenements around central courtyards so everyone could get enough light and fresh air. He even brings up this committee from like 10 years earlier that said it was basically impossible for people to be physically and morally healthy when they were crammed into those tiny little apartments. It's pretty amazing how forward-thinking he was, you know?
It is. It's really a powerful book. So now let's shift gears completely and dive into the world of the Law of One. Can you give us a little background on where this material came from and what it's all about?
Okay, so the Law of One is totally different from Riis's book. It's this channeled information that supposedly came from an entity called Ra, and it was received by this research group, Carla, Dawn, and Jim, starting back in 1981. The main idea is that everything is one, everything is connected. They call it the One, or the infinite creator. It gets into some pretty wild stuff, like the nature of illusion and how the creator wants all parts of itself to experience love, and how meditation can help us understand all this. I mean, there's definitely a lot of what some UFO researchers would call high strangeness going on here.
And the teachings are supposed to be from this group called the Confederation of Planets, right? What's their goal in sharing this information with us?
Yeah, that's right. The Confederation of Planets, they basically say they want to help people who are actively looking for knowledge and understanding. They say that their cosmic philosophy, even though it sounds really complicated, is actually pretty simple at its core. They don't claim to have all the answers, but they think that their understanding, which they got through going through similar stages of evolution as Earth, can be helpful to us, especially when it comes to serving others. It's almost like they're trying to encourage us to go on our own search for truth and understanding. And that idea of helping those who are seeking, it kind of makes me think about how people react to suffering. Like, maybe seeing the terrible conditions that Riis describes might make someone start searching for answers, you know?
It makes sense. And they also describe the actual process of how they receive this information.
Yeah.
Like what kind of rituals or preparations did they do before each session?
Yeah, they had a whole ritual they do before making contact. They'd set up a Bible, a lit candle, incense, and a chalice of water around Carla. Then she'd recite the prayer of St. Francis. After that, she'd go into this trance state, and Ra would use her body to talk, answering questions that Dawn would ask. Jim would usually meditate during the session, focusing on sending positive energy to Carla. And when it was over, they'd help her come back to normal and give her the chalice of water, which they thought had been charged with their love vibrations or something. It's like they really believed that intention and focus were important for getting this information. And that actually applies to how we approach solving problems too, right? Like the social problems that Riis is talking about.
Definitely. And when Rack first starts talking, they're really careful to explain how their communication works and how it relates to the Law of One.
Exactly. They say that their message is coming from the one to the one through distortion, and that it's acceptable for meaning. Basically, they're acknowledging that because of limitations with language and because of the nature of our reality, they can't give us a perfect, completely accurate message. They even say, to teach learn is the law of one in one of its most elementary distortions. So even the act of sharing knowledge, that's a distortion of the law of one. And that makes you think, right, if communication itself is distorted, then how can we ever be sure that we're seeing things clearly? Like both the poverty that Riis describes and the more subtle stuff that the law of one talks about.
That's a really good point. And Rao also gives a lot of information about their own history and their past interactions with Earth and its people.
Yeah, they say they're part of the Confederation of Planets, and they first came to Earth around 11,000 years ago. Back then, some human cultures were more aware of their connection to the one creator. Ross says they were a bit naive at first. They thought they could just give humans knowledge directly, but that would have messed with our free will. So they tried to help technologically instead. They used crystals to heal distortions in people's mind, body, and spirit complexes. And according to Ra, that's how they built the big pyramids. They used crystals and the power of the one.
It's a very different explanation for the pyramids than what you usually hear, right? It's like they're saying that physical structures can actually have an effect on our energy and well-being.
So they're saying the pyramids weren't just tombs or monuments. Right. They say the main purpose of the big pyramids was to heal people and balance the planet's energy. And they even explain why they use incense, a Bible, and a candle in their channeling rituals. They say the incense is to energize Carla's body, and the Bible and candle represent love and light to keep her mind and emotions balanced. It's like they're taking a really holistic approach to communication, paying attention to the physical, mental, and spiritual aspects all at the same time. And that makes me think about how the conditions in the tenements must have affected people on all those levels, too.
It makes sense. And healing, according to Ra, has a pretty specific meaning that's tied to the law of one.
Totally. Ross says there are two main types of healers. First, you've got the people who just naturally understand the law of one and are drawn to teaching it. They might not actually do any hands-on healing, but they spread the knowledge. And then there are people who don't necessarily understand the law of one consciously, but they have this open channel that lets them help others heal. So it's like you can be a healer through knowledge or through this more intuitive connection, almost like having a talent for it. Maybe that explains why some people were able to rise above those awful conditions in the tenements, you know. Maybe
Sure.
they had some kind of inner strength or connection that helped them.
It's an interesting thought. And then there's this distinction that Ra makes between the Confederation and another group called the Orion Group. What's the main difference between them?
The big difference is their main motivation. The Confederation, they're all about service to others. They want everyone to be well and to have free will. But the Orion Group, they're all about service to self. They're willing to hurt others to get what they want. Ra actually uses Adolf as an example of someone with negative intentions. He wanted to create an empire by enslaving people who he thought were inferior. But Ra also says that the Orion Group has this built-in weakness. They're all about separation, which creates a lot of internal conflict and chaos. And that makes them vulnerable. And this whole idea of service to others versus service to self, it makes you think about our own society, right? Like, are we structured to help each other, or are we set up to exploit each other?
It's a question worth asking. So let's talk about how humans ended up on Earth in the first place. Ra's explanation is a little surprising. It involves Mars.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. Ross says that the first humans on Earth actually came from Mars around 75,000 years ago. Apparently, Mars was becoming uninhabitable, so they needed a new home. These Martians had their own mind-body-spirit complexes, but some guardian beings made some genetic adjustments to help them adapt to Earth, and they were birthed here in a non-reproductive way. Basically, they were kind of engineered for this new planet. But before the Martians got here, Earth already had life. It was second-density life, which means plants and animals that didn't have the same drive towards consciousness that humans do. But get this, Ross says that some of those second-density creatures actually look kind of human. Isn't that crazy?
It's definitely not what you learn in school. And this idea of different densities is really important in the law of one. What does Ra say about Earth's current density?
So Ross says that Earth itself is currently in fourth density spacetime. But most people on Earth are still vibrating at a third density frequency. And that mismatch, that's why things are so messed up right now. Ra even says that's why it's so hard for us to transition to fourth density. It's like a clock trying to strike the hour, but the gears are all jammed up. Earth is naturally moving into fourth density, but our thoughts and actions are making it really difficult. And when you think about all the negativity and suffering in the tenements, it makes you wonder if that contributed to making the transition even harder.
It's a scary thought. So what exactly is this transition that we're talking about? What does Ra mean by harvest?
Basically, the harvest is like a graduation. It's when people have the chance to move up to a higher density of consciousness. Ra says everyone has free will to choose whether they want to evolve or not. They can accept the opportunity, reject it, or just be completely oblivious to it. And apparently, third density is really good for accelerating spiritual growth. It's like a crash course in learning and evolving. Ra even says that some people who could have graduated 25,000 years ago chose to stay here and help out. And Ra's own mission, they say they've been working for the past 2,300 years to help us have a big positive harvest at the end of this 75,000-year cycle. And if you want to connect with higher beings or move up to a higher density, Ra says you need to understand the law of one. And sometimes traumatic experiences, especially near the end of a cycle, can actually be like wake-up calls that make people start searching for truth. Makes you think about the purpose of suffering, doesn't it? Like, maybe even those people who lived and died in the tenements, maybe their struggles were part of some bigger plan.
Maybe so. Ra also talks about energy centers, which a lot of people know as chakras. They say these centers are really important for transitioning to a higher density.
Yeah, Ross says that if your energy centers are blocked or unbalanced, it's really hard to understand things clearly and to express your true self. And the indigo ray center, which is up in your head near your pineal gland, that one's super important for moving into fourth density. That's because the indigo ray receives the purest form of love and light, and it's like the key to unlocking infinite consciousness. So it makes sense that if you're living in a chaotic, stressful environment like the tenements, your energy centers would be blocked. And that would make it even harder to grow spiritually.
Makes sense. So what about the guardians? Ra mentions them in connection with free will and this planetary quarantine.
Okay, so the guardians are these higher beings who are supposed to be protecting our free will. Ross says they put Earth under quarantine because there was too much interference from outside forces. The Orion group was messing with us, trying to influence our choices without us even realizing it. And while the Orion group is allowed to do that in their own dimension, the Guardians decided it wasn't fair for us because we're not as aware. So the quarantine is basically a way of balancing things out. The Orion group can still try to influence us, but they can't do it directly. And we still have the choice to make our own decisions, even if those decisions are bad ones. It's kind of like how the people in the tenements technically had free will, but their choices were so limited because of their circumstances.
It's a really complicated issue. And another thing that comes up a lot in the Law of One is the importance of having good relationships and serving others.
Oh yeah, Rara is always talking about that. They say it's really beneficial to get along with people and to help each other out. They even say that other people are basically just other selves, like different versions of ourselves. And they say that as we become more self-aware, we naturally become more responsible for others. Like once you realize you exist, you start to understand that other people exist too, and that you have a responsibility to treat them well. And when you see how people were treated in the tenements, it makes you realize how important that is.
Absolutely. And then there's this idea of wanderers, which is pretty fascinating. It's like higher beings are actually coming down to Earth to help us out.
Yeah, wanderers are supposed to be these really evolved beings from higher densities who choose to be born on Earth to help us evolve. But when they come here, they forget who they really are and what they can really do. It's like they take on a human form and experience life like we do. Ross says that sometimes they get messages from these higher beings, like thought projections, and those projections are what people sometimes see as UFOs. They even talk about this guy named Morris who seemed immune to all the negativity around him, like he had this special protection because he was a wanderer. And that makes you wonder, right? Could there be people among us who are actually from somewhere else trying to help us?
A mind-blowing thought. So Ra also talks about this thing called intelligent infinity and these different color rays that come from it.
Yeah, intelligent infinity is like the pure potential of the creator, and it gets activated when we use our free will. And each color ray, like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, they all represent different aspects of this intelligent energy. Ross also talks about logos, which is kind of like a god or a creator of a star system.
Sure.
Our sun is a sub.